Hey everyone, so every week the rest of the semester I'll make a short video giving you some of my thoughts on the week ahead as part of sort of a preview. And I'll probably try to get it out earlier in future weeks, but this week being the first time I needed an extra day or two, it'd probably be more useful if I got these published on Tuesday or Wednesday. But thanks to everyone that's already posted to the discussion board. I think there's a good conversation starting there, and I'm excited to see where it goes. This week we're moving further from the formal role of the president into the sort of things that they do day to day. We talked about the relationship of the president to Congress, both broadly in week 3 and in a really specific context in week 4. Here we move to the relationship to the citizenry, the people, the public, and the way that that relationship is often built and mediated through the media. I think the article, Why the Media Loves the President, but the President Hates the Media, does a great job at both advancing a specific argument, but also giving a really wide background on the topic. It answers that question. Why does the media love the president? Why does the president hate the media? But in doing that, it also gives this really rich background. And that helps to build the discussion for this week because all of us are fairly young. We all remember sort of the current presidency, but it's hard to have that sort of grasp of the 300-year history and how presidents used to communicate with the public. Going back to sort of the early days of the republic, most citizens never saw their president either live or in any sort of setting. George Washington did a tour of the country shortly after becoming president, and it was a really big deal that people actually got to see this guy, George Washington, the most famous American alive. And for a long time, there really was this divide between the president and the citizens, and that gap was filled by newspapers, which were both, many of which were friendly to the president, or more specifically, newspapers were partisan at that time. They, sort of mirroring what we do modernly, but some newspapers would support one party and other newspapers would support the other. And so the media was very much pushing the narrative of whichever party that they liked. And all politicians were having to mediate their relationship and their conversation with the public through that form of media. And all of this goes hand in hand with campaigning. And we'll talk about campaigns in the future. I think that's either next week or the week after. But presidents didn't used to campaign for the office. They didn't talk directly to the people. And that wasn't because they thought that they were better than the people or that they, were above the people. But it was because politics was seen as a vile pursuit. We didn't want politicians to actually pursue the office. And so the presidents avoided going to the people. And so they used this mediary of the newspapers to communicate and to build support and to advance their sort of goals. But they also just didn't have the ability to go and talk to the people. If George Washington wanted to do a campaign of all of the states at that time, it would have taken years to travel between them. We didn't have sort of the technology in place. And so that, of course, evolved over time. And as radio began to be used, most famously by FDR, citizens were able to get a little bit more direct access to the president. And that was really important for Roosevelt because he was able to talk to the citizens, communicate what was going on with the Great Depression, with World War II, and help them to feel buoyed that there was someone out there that was actually concerned about the course of events. And moving forward, though, the relationship was still really mediated by the radio and by newspaper because the president couldn't carry a microphone with them and talk to the citizens every sort of hour of the day. It was always a set schedule. It was going to be scripted. It was going to be controlled. And we see that continue to sort of evolve. Once TV becomes a lot bigger, you could see sort of the changes occurring in the country. JFK, of course, was really good at using these new medias really well, partially because he was very photogenic and a very likable guy, but he was willing to sort of push the envelope in how politicians communicated. And so out of the podcast we get this week, this history of the news conference and a lot of the fears that went into actually a president talking to the American people directly. And this turning point in the relationship of the president to the public. And it's interesting to think about whether those fears about press conferences were actually realized with the press conference, because there's always this long history of people being very weary of new technologies and thinking that every new technology is going to be the downfall of civilization. But as we sort of continued on, in the 40 years since Kennedy's press conference, has the sort of relationship of the president to the public changed fundamentally? Has the president sort of lowered themselves? They're less worried about policy. They're less sort of in the weeds with these things. And is that sort of a result of the importance of press conferences and being able to be photogenic and being able to sort of communicate in that way? As Young and Perkins argue, though, as important as Kennedy's press conference was, that relationship didn't last. Eventually, there were just too many different options on television. People weren't going to tune in anymore. And so is sort of the way that press conferences change the American politics more a result of TV changing voters or TV changing the presidency? Or how do you disentangle those two different things, that symbiotic relationship? And then, of course, we get to sort of the modern era, and we get to the advent of Twitter and social media and this very, very direct, visceral relationship between the president and the public. And I thought Ott's article was really good. Some of it I don't agree with. I think the tone could be a little bit more neutral in sort of a scholarly way. I think the author's politics shine through more than I'm usually comfortable with. But I assigned it because it does a really good job of talking about how Twitter is being used. As sort of, we all know what Twitter is. Some of you probably have Twitter, I don't. And so we understand it as sort of a physical thing, but thinking about the theory behind what is Twitter and how do we use Twitter and what makes Twitter a good or a bad means of communication is worth sort of doing in this class. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we have to grapple with this week is how Twitter and other forms of media change communication. Does the medium change communication, or does communication change to shape the media? If a radio debate between candidates, is that different than a televised debate? Or is it just because there's different politicians that are going to be involved? If Clinton and Trump's campaign happened in the time when there was only newspapers, if it somehow happened in 1790, how different would that look? And alternatively, if Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had their campaign modernly, how different would they look from the politicians that we have today? Does sort of the culture and the media shape the politicians, or do the politicians use the media in the way that they want? And I think that that's sort of interesting to disentangle because in a lot of ways, Trump is a singular presidency. There isn't really one that is like it before. There may not be one that is like it after. And so thinking about, his presidency as this Twitter presidency, will future presidencies be more similar in the way that they communicate, or was that a singular event that will sort of reverse course, in part because of how Facebook and Twitter are reacting to, new bans on certain forms of communication and labeling things as false or potentially misleading. And to some degree, the media is reacting and altering itself as sort of politicians use it. The final reading for this week goes in a slightly different direction. It's more directly, a lot of the readings are about the media sort of mediating the relationship between the president and the public. And this last article is just about sort of the direct relationship between the president and the public, skipping over the media. And it's on this idea of the cult of personality. And the argument there is that citizens have a different relationship to the president in sort of the last 12 years and sort of more the last 50 years. But people didn't used to feel so personally attached to the president. The president didn't used to produce so much sort of personal paraphernalia. We can all think of the MAGA hats, the red hats people wear, but also the really, I can't think of the word for it, but the Pope posters that Obama made really famous. And people didn't used to feel so attached to the president. And, to some degree it was Kennedy first and then Reagan. But the author makes this argument that sort of personal attachment is a little bit dangerous. And I thought about this article earlier when the primaries still mattered in this pre-COVID world where politics was going on. But and the Democrats had a large slate of candidates. And I had this sort of thought at one point after reading this article again that, Biden wasn't my top choice amongst the Democratic nominees. But I don't know if that is that important, right? The consensus choice that the most people feel okay with, even if it's not, they don't love him, that might be better for everyone. We we don't need our top love choice in the presidency because most people will feel differently. And it's sort of a coarse analogy, but if you think of the president as sort of like a car, do you need one that matches your identity that, you feel personally attached to, or is, just a car that's serviceable that gets you to work okay? How much do we need to think and care about the president? How important should the president be in that they're, co-equal with Congress? There's a lot of politicians. Does the president have to be this singular person? And to some degree, this article, it's a little bit old. And recently I've been reading a lot about this idea of mega identities, this idea that people have sort of consolidated their identities behind a political party. And so everything that I am is the antithesis of what the other party is. And I think a lot of that speaks to the president, that the president becomes the symbol of the party. And so the cult of personality has more to do with the way that the parties have become sort of aligned behind a very consistent ideology as opposed to anything that's sort of going on political. It's more of an accident than anything intentional. And I would encourage you to check out the writing on mega identities. It's really interesting literature if you're interested in political psychology, but that's a bit beyond this class. And so that's what we're reading this week. That's what we're grappling with and trying to deal with. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you all think in the discussion board.